The moment I stepped through that massive mahogany door, I knew I had just made either the smartest decision of my life or the worst mistake imaginable. Lorraine Whitman's face froze into something that tried to pass for a smile, but failed halfway through, like someone biting into a lemon and pretending it tasted sweet. Her eyes traveled slowly from my simple navy dress to my modest flats, lingering just long enough for me to feel the judgment settle in. I saw it clearly then. In her mind, she had already measured my worth, calculated my value, and found me lacking, and that was before she even spoke. Before we go on, please subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I really do read every comment. She leaned toward her son, Derek, and whispered something she clearly believed I couldn't hear. But I did. Every word. She said I looked like household staff who had wandered in through the wrong entrance. That was the exact moment I knew this dinner was going to be unforgettable. My name is Alicia Lewis. I was 32 years old at the time, and I had been keeping a secret for 14 months. Not a harmless secret. Not the kind you laugh about later. The kind that reshapes everything once it comes out. I made $45,000 every single month. Before taxes. After taxes, it was still an amount that made financial advisors pause and ask me to confirm the numbers. I was a senior software architect at one of the largest tech firms in the Pacific Northwest. I had been writing code since I was 15, sold my first application at 22, and spent the years after that building systems most people never realize run their daily lives. I held multiple patents. I spoke at international conferences. I had stock options worth more than most people's homes. And Derek Whitman believed I was barely getting by. I never technically lied to him. When we met at a coffee shop over a year earlier, he asked what I did for work. I said I worked in tech. He nodded, then asked if I handled scheduling for executives. I smiled, gave a vague answer about supporting the team, and let him fill in the blanks all by himself. Why would I let the man I was falling in love with think I was struggling when I was anything but? Because of my grandfather. Ezekiel Lewis was still very much alive, still sharp, still stubborn, and still the most influential person in my life. He lived simply by choice, not necessity. He drove an old car, wore plain clothes, and believed wealth revealed people faster when it was hidden rather than displayed. He taught me one lesson above all others. He said a person's true character shows when they think no one important is watching, when they believe you have nothing to offer them. That was the lesson I carried with me as I stood inside the Whitman estate, smiling politely while being silently dismissed. When Derek invited me to meet his family, when he warned me that his mother cared deeply about appearances, I made a decision. I would arrive exactly as they expected, unassuming, modest, easy to overlook, and then I would watch. The Whitman estate looked exactly like money trying to prove something. The driveway alone felt longer than some neighborhoods I had lived in, curving dramatically toward wrought iron gates trimmed with gold accents that served no purpose beyond announcing excess. Every blade of grass was cut with surgical precision, as if chaos itself had been outlawed on the property. I pulled my 12-year-old Subaru slowly up the drive, acutely aware of how out of place it looked among the luxury vehicles already parked near the entrance. For a brief moment, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair was pulled back into a low ponytail. My makeup was light. The only jewelry I wore was a small gold pair of studs Ezekiel had given me years earlier. I looked exactly like someone who did not belong there. Perfect. Derek met me at the door and kissed my cheek, but it felt rehearsed, like a performance meant for an audience just inside. His eyes flicked over my dress, my shoes, my lack of accessories, and something passed over his face so quickly I almost missed it. Embarrassment. I stored that observation away without reacting. Inside, the house was a shrine to presentation. Crystal chandeliers hung from every ceiling. Large framed paintings lined the walls, impressive at a glance until you noticed they were prints, not originals. Everything was expensive. Nothing felt warm. Lorraine Whitman stood waiting in the foyer like a queen receiving subjects. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, immovable, and her designer dress looked like it had never known comfort. When she extended her hand, her grip was limp, dismissive, already done with me. That was when she made the comment to Derek. The one about me looking like the help. I smiled and pretended I hadn't heard a word. Dinner began shortly after, and from the moment we sat down, it felt less like a meal and more like an evaluation. The table was long, the place settings elaborate. I counted 6 forks. 6. Lorraine noticed my glance and smiled thinly, remarking that she supposed I wasn't accustomed to formal dining. I replied that my grandfather always said the food mattered less than the people you shared it with. Her smile tightened. She asked where I grew up. I answered honestly, a small town in Oregon. She asked about my parents. I told her Ezekiel had raised me. She offered a sound meant to convey sympathy, then commented on how difficult it must have been growing up without proper guidance. I told her my grandfather had given me everything I needed. That was when Terrence Whitman entered the conversation. Derek's older brother arrived late, as if punctuality were beneath him. He wore an expensive suit and an expression of bored superiority. His greeting consisted of a single word delivered without warmth. "Hello?" He turned immediately back to Lorraine, launching into a conversation that excluded me entirely. Derek sat beside me, uncomfortable, silent. I noted that too. Calvin Whitman was quieter. He watched more than he spoke, his eyes sharp but tired, like a man who had learned that resistance only exhausted him. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm but unenthusiastic. Then there was Samuel Jenkins. He was introduced as an old family friend and business associate. Older, silver-haired, observant. When he shook my hand, his eyes lingered on my face with something like recognition. He studied me as if trying to place a memory just out of reach. Throughout dinner, Lorraine and Terrence took turns reminding me of my place. They asked questions designed to diminish, comments framed as concern, comparisons I never asked for. Derek attempted half-hearted defenses, never strong enough to challenge his mother, never lasting more than a sentence. And Samuel Jenkins kept watching me, quietly, thoughtfully, as if he already knew this story was far from over. By the time the first course was cleared, I already understood the rules of the room. Speak only when spoken to. Never take up too much space. Smile, but not too confidently. Lorraine's questions came one after another, each one carefully sharpened to expose weakness. She asked about my work again, narrowing her eyes slightly when I repeated that I worked in tech. She asked if I handled administrative tasks. I said I supported development teams. She nodded as if everything had fallen neatly into place. She commented that every company needed people like that. Terrence smirked into his wineglass. Then Lorraine mentioned Nia Castellano. The name landed deliberately, like a stone dropped into still water. She spoke it casually, almost fondly, and followed it with a comment about how well Nia was doing, how her family's business was expanding, how impressive it all was. I watched Derek closely. His jaw tightened for just a second before he forced a smile. Lorraine continued. She said Nia had always fit so well into their world. 3 years together? She added, as if sharing trivia. She spoke about expectations, about how everyone had assumed that relationship would lead somewhere permanent. Behind me, photographs lined the wall. Family holidays, celebrations, and in several of them, Nia stood beside Derek, her arm linked through his, her presence unmistakable. Lorraine followed my gaze and said nothing, but her satisfaction was clear. Terrence leaned forward then, his tone amused. He said it was surprising Nia was still single. Almost like she was waiting for something. I smiled and said she sounded remarkable. That response clearly disappointed him. Lorraine recovered quickly. She commented that she hoped I wouldn't feel overwhelmed by their lifestyle, given my more modest background. She used the word common carefully, politely, as if softening the insult made it acceptable. Derek finally spoke, weakly, saying his mother didn't mean anything by it. Lorraine patted his hand and said she only wanted what was best for her son. The implication hung in the air. Calvin attempted to redirect the conversation, asking about my hobbies. I mentioned reading, hiking, cooking simple meals. Terrence laughed, calling it charming, like listening to a child describe their favorite things. Samuel Jenkins spoke then, his voice calm but firm. He said there was value in simple pleasures. He mentioned his own upbringing, his grandmother's modest life, her contentment. Lorraine shot him a look sharp enough to silence lesser men. Samuel ignored it. He asked my grandfather's name. I said Ezekiel Lewis. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition? Understanding? He nodded slowly and returned to his plate without another word. The rest of the meal followed the same rhythm. Questions meant to belittle. Smiles meant to wound. Derek's silence grew heavier with each passing minute. By the time dessert arrived, I had learned everything I needed to know. Not just about Lorraine and Terrence, but about Derek. The man I thought I knew wouldn't let someone speak to me this way. The man sitting beside me did. As the plates were cleared, Lorraine announced coffee in the sitting room. Conversation split. Terrence excused himself for a call. Lorraine disappeared toward the back of the house, and for the first time that evening, I was left alone with my thoughts. And an opportunity. I excused myself and asked where the restroom was. Derek pointed down a long hallway lined with oversized artwork and polished floors that reflected the light like mirrors. I walked slowly, letting the sound of conversation fade behind me. The house felt less like a home the farther I went, more like a showroom designed to impress people who never stayed long enough to notice the emptiness. I wasn't actually looking for the restroom. I was looking for clarity. As I passed one of the doors, I heard voices. Lorraine's voice, sharp and low. Terrence's voice answering her, irritated, impatient. I hesitated. Every reasonable instinct told me to keep walking, to mind my business, to avoid becoming the kind of person who listened through doors. But then I heard my name. I stopped. Lorraine was saying they needed to handle this quickly, that Derek couldn't be allowed to make a mistake that would jeopardize everything they had worked for. Terrence agreed, scoffing that he never thought Derek would take this situation so far. He said he assumed I was a phase, something temporary, like Derek's brief obsession with minimalist living. Lorraine said this was different. This woman, she said, could ruin everything. My heart began to race, not with fear, but with a cold, focused alertness. Terrence mentioned timing. He said the merger with the Castellano family had to go through, that Derek needed to be with Nia for it to work. Lorraine confirmed it, her voice tight with frustration. She said the business couldn't survive another year without that partnership. The dealerships were already stretched thin. Too much debt. Too little margin. So that was it. This wasn't about taste or class. This was strategy. Terrence laughed softly and said Derek was an idiot. He said Derek had actually grown attached to me, that he was supposed to keep me around as a placeholder while they finalized the real plan. Lorraine responded that they would handle it. They always did. Terrence asked how. Lorraine said they would announce the engagement publicly. Tonight. Lock Derek into the image. Then later, they would find a reason to end it. Some flaw, some scandal, something that would make it look justified. Terrence joked that it wouldn't be hard. Girls like me always had something to hide. Lorraine laughed. She said at least I was too naive to suspect anything. Too grateful that someone like Derek had chosen me at all. I stepped back from the door, my hands trembling, but my mind perfectly clear. They didn't see me as a person. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't even an obstacle. I was a prop. I found the restroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me wasn't broken. She wasn't confused. She was calculating. I had come here to test Derek's family. They had failed. But the test had revealed something far worse. Derek wasn't trapped between me and them. He was part of the plan. I washed my hands, took a breath, and fixed my expression into a calm, pleasant smile. By the time I left that bathroom, my decision was made. If they thought I was naive, I would let them keep that belief. Because underestimating someone like me was a mistake they were about to regret. When I returned to the sitting room, the atmosphere had shifted. Furniture had been rearranged just enough to feel intentional. The lighting was softer, warmer. Lorraine stood near the fireplace, her posture alert, expectant. Calvin hovered by the doorway, uneasy. Terrence pretended to study a painting, though his attention kept drifting toward Derek. Derek stood in the center of the room, waiting. He turned when he saw me, relief flashing across his face before he masked it with a practiced smile. He took my hands, his palms slightly damp, and said he wanted to ask me something. His voice sounded rehearsed, like lines memorized just well enough to pass. He said he knew his family could be overwhelming. He said he knew things had moved quickly. He said he was sure about one thing. Then he dropped to one knee. The ring caught the light immediately. Large, flashy, designed to impress from a distance. Up close, I noticed the flaws. The stone lacked clarity. The setting was uneven. It was the kind of ring meant to look expensive in dim lighting, not withstand scrutiny. Much like the proposal itself. Behind him, Lorraine clasped her hands together, barely containing her triumph. Terrence smirked. Calvin looked away. Derek asked me to marry him. I understood everything in that moment. This was the plan. Public commitment, applause, appearances secured. They would unravel it later, quietly, strategically, once Nia was back where she belonged. I could have said no. I could have ended it there, walked out with my dignity intact, and never looked back. But then I remembered the hallway, the laughter, the word placeholder. So I smiled, and I said yes. Applause filled the room. Lorraine clapped as if attending a performance. Terrence offered congratulations that felt like an insult wrapped in politeness. Calvin shook Derek's hand, murmuring approval. Samuel Jenkins met my eyes from across the room. Something passed between us. Understanding, curiosity, maybe even respect. The rest of the evening blurred together. Champagne glasses, engagement talk, Lorraine discussing venues, Terrence joking about guest lists, Calvin mentioning how alliances could strengthen business opportunities. Derek stayed close to me, playing the role of devoted fiancé convincingly. If I hadn't heard what I had heard, I might have believed him. When it was finally time to leave, Derek walked me to my car. The night air was cool, quiet. He asked if I was okay. Said his family would come around. I told him I was just tired. He kissed me goodnight and stepped back. I drove away wearing his ring and carrying a plan far more solid than the diamond on my finger. By morning, I would begin confirming everything I already suspected. And once I started, there would be no stopping it. The next morning, I approached the situation the way I approached every complex system at work. I gathered data. I followed patterns. I looked for weaknesses hidden beneath polished surfaces. My career had taught me that nothing impressive on the outside was flawless on the inside. The Whitman dealerships were worse than I expected. Public records told a story of rapid expansion fueled by debt. Loans stacked on top of loans. Aggressive growth during profitable years without the infrastructure to sustain it, once conditions shifted. Sales declining, margins shrinking. Their primary manufacturer agreement was approaching renewal, and the signs were clear. The company was already looking for alternatives. The Castellano partnership was not optional. It was survival. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. Terrence Whitman had been quietly siphoning money from the business for years. It started small, hidden in expense reports and miscellaneous accounts. Over time, the amounts grew bolder. Luxury travel, jewelry, vehicles registered under shell companies. By the time I finished tracing the trail, the total reached well into the hundreds of thousands. I saved everything: documents, statements, screenshots, timelines. Then I made calls. Ezekiel listened quietly as I explained what I had uncovered. When I finished, he said only one thing. He told me to be careful. He reminded me that truth carried weight, and weight could crush careless hands. But he trusted my judgment. He always had. One of my calls led me to Samuel Jenkins. When I mentioned my grandfather's name, the line went quiet for a moment. Then Samuel exhaled slowly and said he had suspected as much. He told me about a deal from years ago. Not illegal, just unethical. The Whitmans had benefited. He had absorbed the loss. He had never forgotten. We began meeting discreetly. He brought his own files, his own stories. A pattern emerged. The Whitmans had built their reputation on sharp practices and carefully managed appearances. People who questioned them were pushed out quietly. People who benefited stayed silent. Samuel asked me why I was doing this, why I didn't just walk away. I told him it wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure, about making sure people like Lorraine and Terrence couldn't keep treating human beings like interchangeable pieces on a board. He nodded and said Ezekiel would be proud. That was when I knew I was on the right path. For the next few weeks, I played my role perfectly. The agreeable fiancé, the quiet presence at family dinners. I smiled through Lorraine's comments. I watched Terrence flaunt wealth he hadn't earned. And I watched Derek. He had changed. Or maybe I had simply stopped seeing what I wanted to see. His attentiveness felt rehearsed. His phone was always face down. Notifications silenced. One name appeared more than once when he thought I wasn't looking. Nia. One evening, Derek told me he was meeting a client. Instead, I parked across the street from the restaurant. I watched through the window as he sat across from her, close enough to touch. He reached for her hand. She leaned in, smiling. I took photos, not for leverage, for clarity. When I got home, I added them to the file. The system was almost fully mapped now. And once you understand a system completely, you know exactly how to bring it down. By the time the engagement party was announced, I was already several steps ahead of everyone involved. Lorraine treated the planning like a coronation. Every detail had to signal power, stability, and success. White tents, live music, a guest list carefully curated to include everyone whose opinion mattered in the regional business circle. She wanted the world to believe the Whitman family was untouchable. I let her believe it too. The weeks leading up to the party were an exercise in restraint. I listened. I observed. I smiled when appropriate and stayed silent when silence served me better. Derek played his role well, attentive in public, distracted in private. His messages to Nia continued. He didn't bother hiding them as carefully anymore. In his mind, I was already secured. A box checked. Samuel and I finalized the details quietly. He spoke with the manufacturer's representative. I shared documentation, financial records, evidence of mismanagement, proof that Terrence's activities were not isolated mistakes, but a pattern. The response was exactly what we expected. Interest, concern, preparation. The night before the party, I gave Derek one final opportunity to be honest. We sat together going over details, his voice light, his smile easy. I asked him how he felt about us, about our future. He said he was excited. He said he couldn't wait to marry me. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me. Anything at all. For just a moment, fear flickered in his eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by reassurance. He said there was nothing. He said I was everything he wanted. I mentioned Nia's name casually. His face went pale. He recovered quickly, claiming she was just an old friend. Nothing more. I nodded. In that moment, I understood something important. Derek would never tell the truth if the truth inconvenienced him. He wasn't confused. He wasn't pressured. He was choosing deception because it benefited him. The next evening, I stood in my apartment and opened the closet Derek had never seen. The dress I chose was nothing like the one I had worn to that first dinner. Deep emerald, clean lines, custom fitted, elegant without shouting. My jewelry was minimal but unmistakable to anyone who understood quality. Ezekiel's diamond pendant rested at my throat, heavy with history. I looked at my reflection and felt no nerves. Only clarity. I drove to the estate in my old Subaru, watching the valet hesitate, unsure whether to take my keys. I handed them over with a smile. As I walked toward the tent, conversation slowed. Heads turned. I felt the shift before anyone spoke. This was not the woman they expected. This was not the version they had categorized and dismissed. The first face I recognized was Calvin's. His practiced smile faltered as his eyes moved from my face to my dress to the quiet confidence in my posture. Confusion replaced certainty. Good. That confusion would spread. And by the end of the night, it would become something far more dangerous for the Whitman family than confusion. It would become truth. Inside the main tent, the air hummed with polite conversation and restrained laughter. Champagne flowed freely. A string quartet played near the fountain, their music smooth and inoffensive, designed to fade into the background. Everything about the evening was curated to suggest elegance and control. I moved through the crowd slowly. The reactions followed a predictable pattern. A glance, a second look, a pause that lingered a beat too long. Then the quiet recalculation. People whispered to their companions. Phones came out discreetly. Questions were asked without words. I introduced myself when necessary. Alicia Lewis, Derek's fiancé. Each time, the confusion deepened. Several guests clearly knew Lorraine's version of me. The modest girl, the quiet one, the safe choice, the woman who should have been grateful just to be there. None of that matched what stood in front of them now. Calvin approached me near the bar. He congratulated me, his voice stiff, his eyes scanning me as if searching for an explanation written somewhere on my dress. I thanked him and commented on the beauty of the event. He nodded, distracted, already losing focus. Across the tent, I spotted Lorraine. She was holding court near the champagne fountain, laughing loudly, her posture radiating confidence. She hadn't noticed me yet. I watched her for a moment, studying the ease with which she performed. Then I turned and spoke with a small group of guests nearby. One of them worked in private equity, another in automotive distribution. A third recognized my company's name the moment I mentioned it. Their expressions shifted instantly. Interest replaced politeness. Questions followed. Then someone asked about my grandfather. I said, Ezekiel Lewis. Eyebrows rose, heads tilted, recognition flickered. His reputation still traveled quietly through certain circles. Not flashy, just respected. That was when Lorraine saw me. Her laughter cut off mid-breath. Her smile faltered. Her eyes locked onto mine. I watched the transformation unfold in real time. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and beneath it all, something colder. Fear. She excused herself abruptly and crossed the space toward me, her steps measured, controlled. Terrence appeared beside her moments later, his expression tight, calculating. Lorraine asked where I had gotten my dress. Her voice was pleasant, but strained. I told her I had saved it for a special occasion. Terrence chimed in, asking if it was a rental, his tone falsely casual. I named the designer. Terrence's mouth opened, then closed again. Lorraine's gaze sharpened. She asked why Derek had never mentioned any of this. I smiled gently and said Derek had never asked. That I worked in tech. That I supported teams. All of which was true. She stared at me, searching for cracks. I excused myself before she could press further. Behind me, I heard her hiss Terrence's name. I heard him respond that none of this made sense. I didn't look back. The narrative was already shifting. I could feel it moving through the crowd like a current. The version of me they had been given was dissolving, replaced by questions Lorraine could no longer control. And the night was still young. Derek found me near the edge of the tent, his face pale, his movements tense. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was no longer solid. He asked what was going on. He asked where the dress came from, why people were reacting the way they were, why he felt like he had walked into a version of reality he didn't recognize. I told him calmly that I hadn't changed. I told him this was who I had always been. He asked if we could talk somewhere private. I said later. I reminded him that this was our engagement party and that appearances mattered to his family. The irony wasn't lost on me. I took his arm and guided him toward a small group gathered near the bar. These were not casual guests. These were decision makers, industry executives, people whose opinions carried consequences. I introduced myself properly this time, giving my full name and my role at my company. I watched recognition ripple across their faces. One man said he had heard of me. He mentioned a software platform his company had recently evaluated. Another asked if I was related to Ezekiel Lewis. When I confirmed it, her expression changed instantly. She spoke about my grandfather's business sense, his integrity, the quiet influence he had carried for decades. Derek stiffened beside me. He hadn't known any of this. Not because it was hidden, but because he had never bothered to look. As the evening progressed, the conversations multiplied. Guests compared notes, phones buzzed. Whispers traveled faster now, no longer curious, but urgent. I saw Lorraine across the tent speaking quickly with Calvin, her composure cracking at the edges. Terrence hovered nearby, his confidence evaporating with every passing minute. Samuel Jenkins arrived shortly after. He approached me with a nod and a quiet smile, asking if I was ready. I told him I was. He informed me that the manufacturer's representative was present and very interested in the information he had already reviewed. Everything was in place. Lorraine intercepted me moments later, gripping my arm just tightly enough to feel threatening. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I asked her to clarify. She accused me of misleading her family, of embarrassing them, of pretending to be someone I wasn't. I told her I had never pretended. I told her I worked in tech. I told her I supported teams. I told her I lived simply by choice. The assumptions had been hers, and Derek's. She said Derek had told her I was struggling. I said Derek had spoken for himself. Then I told her why. I repeated Ezekiel's lesson. That character revealed itself when people believed no one important was watching. I told her I wanted to know who the Whitmans really were. Her face drained of color. Before she could respond, the music stopped. Calvin's voice came over the speaker system, welcoming everyone and announcing that it was time for speeches. Lorraine released my arm slowly, her eyes locked on mine with something close to panic. I smiled and walked toward the stage. The moment they had feared had arrived. The stage sat beneath soft lights and carefully arranged flowers, designed to frame a perfect moment. Calvin stood at the microphone, thanking guests for coming, speaking about family, tradition, and the importance of strong partnerships. His words sounded practiced, safe, the kind meant to reassure investors as much as relatives. Lorraine joined him seamlessly, her smile polished back into place. She spoke about her son's engagement, about new beginnings, about how proud she was. She hinted at exciting opportunities ahead, at growth and expansion, her voice gaining confidence as she built towards something bigger. A promise. I watched the manufacturer's representative shift uncomfortably near the front. I saw Samuel meet his eyes and give a subtle nod. Lorraine called Derek to the stage. He climbed the steps stiffly, scanning the crowd until he found me. Relief flickered across his face, quickly replaced by uncertainty. Lorraine said there was one more person she wanted to invite up. She said she wanted to welcome her future daughter-in-law. She said my name. The tent went quiet as I walked forward. Conversation stopped. Eyes followed me. I could feel the weight of expectation pressing in from every direction. I joined Derek on the stage. He reached for my hand, his grip unsure. Lorraine handed me the microphone. She said she was sure I wanted to say a few words. I looked at her, then at Derek. Then, out at the crowd filled with people whose decisions would shape the Whitman family's future. I took a breath and smiled. I said I did want to say a few words. I thanked Lorraine for the welcome she had given me. I thanked the Whitman family for teaching me so much in such a short time. Lorraine's smile wavered. I said when I first came to their home, I made a decision. I said I presented a simple version of myself. Someone without expensive clothes or impressive titles. Someone easy to overlook. The tent was completely silent. I said I wanted to see how they would treat someone they believed had nothing to offer them. Someone they thought was beneath their notice. Someone they considered common. Lorraine's face went pale. I described that first dinner, the whispered insults, the comparisons to Derek's ex, the assumptions about my worth. Derek stared at me, his expression unraveling. Then I said I had heard something else. I described the conversation in the study. I described learning I was a placeholder, a temporary distraction while another relationship was being negotiated. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I said I learned the Whitman dealerships were in serious trouble. I said they were desperate for a merger to survive. I said Derek had been maintaining another relationship the entire time we were together. I lifted my phone and showed the photo. Derek and Nia, hands linked across a table. Derek grabbed my arm and said he could explain. I said he already had. I told the crowd there was more. And then I named it. The debt. The declining sales. The franchise agreement on the brink. Calvin's face drained of color. I looked directly at Terrence and said his name. I said he had been stealing from the company for years, that the money had funded his lifestyle while the business collapsed. Terrence shouted that it was a lie. Samuel stepped forward holding a folder. He said it wasn't a lie. He handed the documentation to the manufacturer's representative. Years of proof. The murmurs turned into shock. Lorraine screamed about defamation. I told her she was welcome to test that claim. I removed the ring from my finger. I said I would not be marrying Derek Whitman. I said I had never intended to once I learned the truth. I placed the ring in his hand and told him to give it to Nia. The silence was absolute. I introduced myself properly then. I said I was Alicia Lewis. I said I was a senior software architect. I said I lived simply because I chose to, not because I lacked options. I set the microphone down and walked off the stage. No one stopped me. The crowd parted as I moved through the tent, a quiet ripple following in my wake. Behind me, the illusion of control collapsed in real time. Lorraine's voice rose first, sharp and frantic, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, that emotions were high, that nothing I had said should be taken seriously. Her words landed without weight. No one was listening anymore. The manufacturer's representative stepped aside, already on his phone, his tone clipped and professional. Other guests avoided eye contact with the Whitmans, drifting toward exits, eager to put distance between themselves and the spectacle unfolding. Business relationships were recalculating themselves by the second. Near the bar, Terrence stood frozen as his wife stared at him in disbelief. Whatever explanations he offered sounded thin even to his own ears. Calvin had sunk into a chair. His shoulders slumped, staring at the floor like a man finally forced to acknowledge cracks he had ignored for years. And Derek. He remained on the stage, the ring still clenched in his hand. His face was a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been regret. Our eyes met briefly. I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No sadness. Just clarity. I stepped outside into the cool night air and took a deep breath. The sounds of the party dissolved behind me, replaced by quiet and distance. The stars overhead were indifferent, steady, unmoved by human ambition and collapse. Samuel joined me near the fountain a few minutes later. He told me it was done. The call had been made. The franchise agreement would be terminated by the end of the month. Without it, the dealerships would not survive. I asked him how he felt. He thought for a moment, then said it felt like relief, like closing a chapter that had been left unfinished for far too long. I understood. He asked what I would do next. I said I would go home. I said I would sleep. I said I would wake up and continue building the life I had already built for myself. One that did not revolve around the Whitman family or their expectations. He told me Ezekiel would be proud. That caught me off guard. Emotion pressed unexpectedly against my chest. I nodded and thanked him. He handed me a business card and told me to call if I ever needed anything. I walked to the valet station, reclaimed my old Subaru from a visibly confused attendant, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I watched guests spill out of the tent, the celebration dissolving into damage control. Lorraine gestured wildly, still trying to command a narrative that no longer belonged to her. I turned my eyes back to the road and didn't look again. The drive home was quiet. No music, no calls, just space. When I reached my apartment, I sat in the car for a long moment before going inside, letting the silence settle. I thought about how close I had come to binding my life to Derek's, to his family, to a future shaped by manipulation and silence. Then I opened my door and went inside. And for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. 1 week later, I was sitting at my small kitchen table with a mug of coffee warming my hands when my phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline caught my attention immediately. The Whitman Automotive Group was facing closure after the termination of its franchise agreement. I opened the article and read every word carefully. The manufacturer had officially severed ties, citing concerns over financial management and ethical violations. Without the franchise, the dealerships could no longer sell new vehicles. Without new inventory, the business model collapsed almost overnight. Former partners had begun coming forward, adding their own complaints to an investigation that was already gaining momentum. Terrence Whitman had been asked to step down pending further review. Authorities were examining irregularities in the company's financial records. The article did not mention my name. I had asked Samuel to keep it that way. I didn't want recognition. I didn't want interviews or speculation. The story wasn't about me. It was about consequences. About what happens when people believe money can insulate them from accountability. I finished my coffee and looked around my apartment. The same modest space I had lived in before all of this began. The same worn furniture. The same quiet view out the window. Nothing about my life had changed on the surface, and yet everything had. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Derek. He said he needed to talk. He said he could explain. He said he had made mistakes, but his feelings for me were real. He asked if we could meet just once for coffee. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I deleted the message. Some conversations only reopen wounds that have already healed. I stood and walked to the window, watching the city wake up below me. Sunlight spilled across rooftops and streets. People moved through their lives unaware of the quiet conclusions being made in other apartments, other kitchens. I touched the pendant at my throat, thinking of Ezekiel, of the lessons he had repeated throughout my life. That character mattered more than comfort. That integrity outlasted status. That self-respect was not negotiable. I got ready for work that morning like any other day. My regular job. My regular responsibilities. Systems to design. Problems to solve. A life built on skill and choice rather than appearances. The Whitman story would continue without me. There would be legal proceedings. There would be fallout. There would be explanations offered too late to matter. That was no longer my concern. I had my own life to live, and for the first time in a very long while, it felt entirely my own. In the days that followed, I noticed something unexpected. The silence felt different, lighter. I hadn't realized how much mental space Derek and his family had been occupying until they were suddenly gone. No more second-guessing conversations. No more bracing myself for subtle insults disguised as concern. No more performing a version of myself designed to be palatable to people who never intended to accept me. Ezekiel called me one evening just to check in. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. He told me he was glad I was home, glad I was safe, and glad I trusted my instincts. He reminded me that walking away was sometimes the bravest decision a person could make. Not every battle needed to be won publicly. Some victories were private. I told him he was right. At work, everything continued as normal. Meetings, deadlines, code reviews. I found comfort in the predictability of it. Systems behaved the way people often didn't. If something broke, you could trace it, understand it, fix it. There was honesty in that. A few colleagues mentioned seeing the news. None of them connected it to me. That anonymity felt like a gift. I didn't want to be known as the woman who destroyed a powerful family. I wanted to be known for my work, for my ideas, for the things I built. Occasionally, I caught myself replaying moments from that first dinner. Lorraine's smile, Terrence's laugh, Derek's silence. I didn't feel anger anymore, just distance. like watching a storm from far away after you've already reached shelter. I realized then that the test I thought I had given the Whitmans had really been for me. I had wanted to know if I could trust my own judgment. If I could walk away even when walking away meant giving up the future I had imagined. The answer was yes. That knowledge stayed with me, steady and reassuring. It showed up in small choices, in how I spoke up in meetings, in how I set boundaries, in how I no longer felt the need to explain my simplicity or justify my success. I understood something clearly now. Wealth didn't change who people were. It only gave them more opportunities to reveal it. And I was finally at peace with what I had seen. Some evenings, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and think about how close I had come to choosing a life that wasn't mine. A life shaped by expectation, by silent compromises, by the constant need to be smaller so others could feel larger. The thought no longer frightened me. It grounded me. I realized how easily comfort can disguise control, how charm can soften manipulation until it feels almost reasonable. Derek had never raised his voice. He had never been cruel outright. He had simply allowed others to decide for him, and in doing so, decided I was optional. That was the quiet danger. Ezekiel used to say that the most important decisions rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as politeness, as patience, as keeping the peace. He warned me that if I wasn't careful, I could wake up one day having lived someone else's version of my life, simply because it seemed easier than disrupting expectations. I understood that now in a way I never had before. I didn't regret what happened. Not the test. Not the confrontation. Not even the public fallout. It had clarified something fundamental. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Not my worth. Not my intelligence. Not my place in a room. I had spent months pretending to be less so others could be more comfortable. The cost of that performance was something I would never pay again. There were moments of sadness, yes. Grief for the relationship I thought I had, for the future I briefly pictured. But grief, I learned, was not the same as regret. Grief passed, regret lingered, and I had none. I moved forward deliberately. I invested more time in friendships that felt mutual. I said no more often. I allowed myself to be seen fully, without apology or explanation. The simplicity I loved was no longer a disguise. It was a choice, made freely. That distinction changed everything. By the time another invitation arrived from a different circle, another polished family with impressive credentials, I smiled and declined without hesitation. I no longer needed tests to recognize truth. I trusted myself now, and that trust was worth more than anything I had ever hidden. The morning light filled my apartment softly as I moved through my routine, unhurried, grounded. Life had returned to its natural rhythm, one shaped by intention rather than reaction. I went to work, solved problems, built systems, and spent my evenings in quiet comfort. Nothing flashy, nothing performative, exactly how I liked it. Sometimes people assume peace arrives with fanfare, that it announces itself loudly after conflict. In truth, peace slipped back into my life quietly, settling into the spaces that had once been crowded by doubt. I no longer wondered what Derek was doing or who he was trying to impress. That chapter had closed completely. If you listened all the way to the end, thank you. It truly means more to me than you know. Before we wrap up, go ahead and like this video and share it if the story blessed you. Ezekiel visited one afternoon not long after everything settled. We sat together, drinking tea, talking about ordinary things. At one point, he looked at me and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words. He told me he was proud, not because of what I had exposed, but because I had chosen myself without bitterness. That mattered more than any outcome. I understood then that the real victory wasn't the collapse of an empire built on arrogance. It was walking away without carrying their values with me. It was refusing to let their measure of worth define my own. I didn't need vindication. I didn't need apologies. I needed alignment with who I was. And I had it. I stepped back fully into my life, into friendships that felt honest, into work that challenged me, into a future that belonged to me alone. There was no dramatic ending, just clarity, just forward motion. The test was over. The lesson remained. For another story that fits your mood, click the video on the left. To hear the latest one, choose the video on the right.
Thank you for listening to this story until the end. Hopefully every moment in the story has touched your heart, brought you some reflection, some emotion, and hope. Thank you for taking the time to experience it with us, and hope that each next story will always accompany you on your life journey.